This is a relevant event for us this evening because, as you know, we try to open up several new avenues to understand global governance dynamics. And your insights in so many fields of global governance. You have been publishing on diplomacy, new ways of diplomacy, on BRICS, the G20 constellation, on celebrities and diplomacy. I remember very well this book, which I like very much, so new actors in the international arenas. So your perspectives and your empirical richness, which you are combining with your theoretical approaches, is absolutely key for the internal debate in the center, and I'm so happy that we have the chance tonight to discuss with you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Thanks, Dirk. Always very generous in your praise. There's lots to praise, of course, about the other people that have given this lecture. I've looked at their biographies. I certainly know one or two of them, so I know I'm in the top level in that sense. I've also sort of been pleased to be in Duisburg for the last 3 months. It's been a fascinating experience. And of course, there's been other people visiting Duisburg that time. I'm struck, of course, that CNN has visited Duisburg. Even the Chinese president has visited Duisburg. And of course, we can see that there's a cluster of companies, logistic activities, that have really sort of captured attention around the world. There's also, of course, the center. And in some ways, of course, people in Canada and North America saying, you're going to Duisburg. You know, what's there? What makes it exciting? And I say, well, there's a center that actually does authentic interdisciplinary work. I mean, because what I've seen in centers, certainly that I've been in, is that it's very easy to get clusters that become silos, that there really isn't that sort of mixture of work. And of course, what I find in the center in Duisburg is very much a sense of the concerns that I have about global politics, but also a concern about local activities, sort of private activities, activities that really are very different in terms of individual sort of navigation of everyday life. And indeed, looking at this, I sort of try to get a sense of balance between what I've done in the past and what I hope to do in the future, to try to hone in a little bit more on those sort of personalistic, private, localistic activities. In the last 20 years, we've seen sort of all sorts of sort of bending of formality in different ways. And of course, I'm sure all of you at least know some of these components. There's informality within the United Nations systems, in the sense of contact groups, certainly going back to something like the Namibia, the Western contact group, up to things that are dealing with sort of rapidly changing notions of governance. Piracy, there's a contact group now. These are important, but so of course are UN participation of sort of wider but still sort of informal organizations. And once more on the left of the screen, in happier days I can see of sort of Russian US sort of engagement in terms of informality, but also of course with the United Nations in the center. This is why pictures are important, to sort of get a sense of sort of that pivotal component of the United Nations, and of course other elements that we might not have expected in 1945. The EU, of course, on one side, and a former leader, Tony Blair, on the others. And of course, I put reference to Tony because I'm also interested in not only celebrities on the right, but also what leaders do in their afterlife. And this is what I've been working on before I got to the center, a sort of a book on sort of the notion of sort of a second sort of tier or retirement of sort of public responsibility, sometimes public irresponsibilities. Thirdly, there's a sense of sort of like-minded groups, caucus groups, and there's a whole set of these times. But because I talked with Silke about these groups, the Geneva group, I think, sort of jumps out, an organization or a forum of countries that are sort of major allocators to the United Nations. So once more, important for the United Nations system, but not a group that everybody would know about. And finally, most probably my favorite still is sort of celebrities. And again, how can we leave Angelina Jolie out? Certainly we can see that there's an interest, of course, that why somebody like Angelina, who certainly doesn't have formal education, doesn't have sort of a pedigree, can not only do work around the world, but also, of course, doing it very much in a legitimate sense within the United Nations framework. And of course, she's not the only one. Certainly, she's done stellar, I think, for the most part, on refugee issues. But there's also, of course, George Clooney as a UN ambassador for peace, on peacekeeping. Again, you go to Delhi and you find out the night before that George Clooney was having dinner with the Indian defense minister, and you think, there's something going on here in terms of the world that's very different than again 1945 would have indicated. And finally, of course, just on celebrities, we have to show that there's a difference between that sense of informality, the Angelina Jolies or the George Clooneys, with the sort of Bonos that don't make any pretense of working for the United Nations. So again, even within the world of celebrities, there's at least two sort of cast of characters. What I want to, though, talk about tonight is much more informality at the core of the system, even though these other elements of informality are important and certainly should not be forgotten and certainly indicate a trend. It's really the informality at the global level, global summitry level, that really dominate, I think, politics since the outbreak of the global financial crisis, and indeed dominate my sort of interests in global politics. And of course, as has been indicated, two of these really sort of jump out. One is the G20. G20 at least elevated to the leaders level in 2008. This is something that I had worked on previously with a former Canadian Prime Minister who was very keen on this type of activity, even though he made the mistake of calling it the L20 rather than the G20. So certainly, sort of again, acronyms matter. And secondly, the BRICS. And of course, here we can see the BRICS also sort of coming up in terms of an elevated form in 2009. And of course, this is not a coincidence, I think, that you get the two types of big sort of global summits with big countries and to some extent big membership involved. And again, a slide on the second of these, the BRICS, the Chinese BRICS. And again, you can see that they even call it the leaders meeting, which is interesting. And again, we can sort of come back to this later on. What we see is a change. And sometimes this can be an ambivalent change. It can certainly talk about the overriding dominance of the United Nations. But whatever the language, it's quite clear that those big countries have embraced global summitry in a different way and embraced informality in a different way than they have in the last 10 or 20 years. The second, and again, not terribly recognized in the literature, is that there's space for other actors. And again, I think in very crude terms, we can talk about space for non-bigs. These are countries that at least in the past would never have really expected to be sort of summit players. And again, we can sort of talk about this in a bit of detail. In terms of global governance, again, Dirk has mentioned global governance, and really this is the prism, the lens that I think is most useful for looking at this sort of clash or the test, the contest between formality and informality. But in some ways, even though it's a very important aspect of the contest, the legitimacy, efficiency debate is becoming somewhat sterile. This has been around for a long time. And again, even though, as I say, it's important, most probably there's other aspects, much more sort of detailed aspects of what informality, if we see informality as an ascendant force, really is doing. And I think once we get into these other aspects, we can see that it's a pretty murky area, that in some ways we can see that it's good to have informality, in other ways we can see that it's not so good in informality as moving up and becoming much more ascendant. The first feature, and a kind of obvious feature, but once more not really taken up by many academics, is a certain arbitrariness. And of course, this is the classic case of informality. All of the cases, all the episodes of informality that I've talked about all have the same sort of arbitrariness, is that there's no sort of logic, no sort of apparent logic that sort of jumps out about why certain countries, certain actors should be involved, others not involved, why there should be meetings in particular places or particular times. And we can sort of explore this also, of course, through the older lens of formality. Because if we are defending the United Nations in terms of legitimacy, and indeed there's lots of defense that can be made in terms of legitimacy, we also have to say that the logic was pretty problematic when we look back at it. Certainly it's a power dynamic in 1945, and a dynamic that has sort of two components of it. One, of course, is strictly power politics. When we see the pictures of FDR and Churchill and Stalin, we sort of get an image of power politics. But of course, these are the victors as well. So there's sort of a logic of victors getting the institutional spoils within the system. And indeed, when we look at the permanent five, when you throw China and France in 1945, we can see just how that logic plays out. You can't say that France was a particularly strong country in 1945, or indeed Chiang Kai-shek. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek's regime was going to fall not all that many years later. But still, because they were on the victor's side, they got the elements. And of course, we can see elements of beneficial sort of logic even to middle powers, right? Why does Canada have a constituency within the IFIs? Why does Canada have the Anglophone Caribbean countries plus Ireland, you know, in terms of its constituency? Again, a legacy, I think, of 1945 politics. And of course, when you throw in the IMF and the World Bank in terms of the logic of power, we can see the same sort of problematic nature of 1945. And in some ways, looking back at executive leadership in these organizations, we can see the logic has become even more hardened over the years. Sweden used to get at least a few chances to have an executive director of the IMF. I haven't seen Sweden having an executive director for decades now. Of course, it's France, occasionally Germany, but usually France, again, sharing those executive positions with the United States and the World Bank. Yes, though, when we look at the summit processes that I'm dealing with, what really does jump out is the arbitrary nature. And I think this makes it problematic in a sense, but it also makes it more fascinating because it is so classically arbitrary. When you look at the G20, this is a construct that was developed in the late 1990s in terms of the G20 finance, another sort of group of informality, even though certainly not as dominant, not as high profile as the G20 leaders after 2008. This was a construct that was developed between two essential finance ministers. Larry Summers, of course, well known, Paul Martin from Canada, less known, but certainly within the circle of finance ministers, well known. And what they did was basically sit down and have sort of on the back of an envelope deal with countries. Say, this country's in, this country's out. And when you actually try to figure out the logic, you really can't find any logic in terms of their their members. So the logic is all over the place. Some, of course, they get in because they are systematically important. It's hard to leave China and India out. But other cases, you don't see that logic. The allies, of course, get in some cases. But of course, over time, the countries that were seen in the late 90s as allies, Turkey sort of jumps out, those probably aren't seen as allies in the same way as in the 21st century. Certainly, being a part of a finance minister's group gets you in or not in, depending on the case. Malaysia doesn't get in because, of course, the Malaysian finance minister is hounded out of office into jail. So certainly, if you look at the G20 as a club, this isn't a good way of getting into a club. But it shows, again, just the strangely arbitrary nature of it all. And of course, even though there's rumors that Argentina gets in because the Argentine finance minister was the roommate of Larry Summers, I looked at this because there's an LSE academic with this. And even though it's true, he does have did have a prominent roommate, the years are off. The roommate only comes in as finance minister in 2001. So even though you kind of like the idea that there's a roommate that you get in, it's probably that's taking arbitrary a bit even a stretch too far. Finally, though, we can see that the real, and maybe there is a logic to this rather than an arbitrariness, is that problem countries get in. And I think here we can see sort of a different construct of clubs where it's not just the strong, not just the powerful, but also countries that are going to cause you difficulties. And of course, when you look back in the 1990s, it was probably countries not only like Turkey, Argentina, but even a country like Brazil stand out as problem countries in terms of contagion for financial crises. The same sort of arbitrariness comes out in the BRICS. And of course, the only logic that you can find in the BRICS, of course, is the Goldman Sachs BRICS. That because Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs declares on a very insightful day in his life that the BRICS are going to be the next big thing, that this is going to be self-justified. That there is going to be a logic moving from Goldman Sachs to the international arena. But when you look at the BRICS more in detail, you find out what a fairly arbitrary organization forum it is. As we mentioned, you can see Russia as a rising power, but certainly not a rising power in the same way as we could see countries from the global south. Certainly the economic strength certainly isn't there. And of course, when you look out at South Africa, even though South Africa has very impressive infrastructure, very impressive human capital, Trevor Manuel, finance minister of South Africa, post-crisis is eminently capable. When you look at the logic that I started out with in terms of Goldman Sachs, South Africa is never seen. It'd be much more logical to have Nigeria in than South Africa. Nigeria doesn't even make the next tandem of countries for Goldman Sachs. It doesn't even make the next 11, as Goldman Sachs would call it. Academic leadership, then, just to start finishing off. We can see that there's a buy-in. There's sort of a catch-up to the literature about formalism and informalism. And again, much of the mainstream literature, both in terms of economic and international relations, I think is doing a much better job. But at the same time, there's probably two areas that they don't sort of spend much time on. And of course, one of these areas is much more sort of the technocratic element, where we can see sort of a new class of technocrats within the G20 and to some extent even within the BRICS that have become very dominant. Again, Mario Draghi, Mark Carney moving from Canada to the English bank are just two of the examples. But I think any country you go and you see who's been a Sherpa, these are people that are elevated in terms of the status, the pedigree of the, not just the national, but the international sort of elite. And again, China, India, and so on. The other area, and of course this is an area that I'm sure many are much more interested in, and we'll talk about this I think in a couple of weeks in a different forum, is much more this sort of the interplay between clubs and networks, where in some ways the G20 has shown some space for non-state actors that I think has to be sort of brought out, I think, in a much greater way. Coming back then to finish off completely from Dirk's introductory points, this sense that somehow the networking, the looseness of the G20 and the BRICS is a sign of weakness. And of course, this is a theme that is picked up particularly by US commentators, because I think they find it very problematic to deal with a decline of hegemony, with a decline of dominance, with a decline of and of course, this is not to say that policymakers haven't responded, but I think at the academic level, academics are sometimes much slower to respond than policymakers. And I think in this regard, this is why you need rapid change, but you can see that even if there's problems, you can see that the image, of course, is somewhat different from what's actually happening on the ground. The image is G0. The image, of course, is BRICS. Now it's sort of, some commentators have come out that the new acronym should be MUSH, you know, that you can pick any 4 countries of the world and, you know, just pick one that's got M and one that's got U, you know, Moldova, Uganda, put them in a package and sell them, you know, Goldman Sachs style. And it shows some sort of the level, I think, of sort of backlash. But when you look at where the real big issues are being discussed, it is those summits that the issues are. And whether it's tapering in the BRICS, or of course, again, even though with mixed results to say the least, on Syria in terms of the Russian US condominium there. What is changing, though, is the sense that there's no going back. There's no going back. Even if the G7 is going to be much more in play rather than the G8 because of Russia, because of Ukraine, we don't see any sign yet that the G20 is jeopardized. I haven't seen any sign that anybody is saying that the G20 is going to be influenced by Ukraine or the Russian. Maybe this will come, but certainly now we can see sort of a segmented response. And of course, even among the BRICS, what is interesting is a certain sense of solidarity on the Ukraine issue from the BRICS countries, which I find fascinating. That Brazil was probably lower key, but still not outright criticism, and of course India and China moderately supportive of the Russian stance. The other, and of course this is I think a very important point, is that we're not going back within the G20 context to an old sense of north-south, not this sort of polarized division. We still see, and again, Stefan has done great work on this, in the sense that there's lots of sort of mixed coalitions, that lots of bargaining, there's lots of negotiating going on. And of course, with this sense of networking, even though there's going to be importance to that approach, there's also, of course, going to be the tests of deliverables. And of course, this is going to be the case in the G20, but of course, it's also going to be the test in the BRICS in terms of having deliverables, particularly tangible results on things like the development bank. So to finish up, on the last slide, or the last 2 slides, we see sort of fragmentation, a sense of flattening, a sense of pluralism, I think, in the world. All of these, of course, conjure up an image of messiness. But when you look at the contrasts, and again, 2 sets of contrasts here are important. Whether there's going to be a reflection of the same trends on the regional level, whether the European Union, of course, is going to become more informal, whether there's going to be a surge of informality in other parts of the world. We see some signs of this in both cases. EU much more in this ad hoc responses. Again, leaders on Ukraine are a good example where you have sort of instant responses by leaders in a matter of days, but also on things like ASEAN, where you have a +3, a +6, a +8 sense. And of course, we can see that if hegemony is breaking down, we also see that the sense of command and control breaking down as well. And if, therefore, in some ways, we're going back to a 19th century world, we're also, of course, going back to a world that mixes some of the 20th century and the 21st century. So again, thank you for listening, and we'll wait for your questions. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Andy, for this truly enlightening presentation. And I must apologize to anybody who might have expected controversial comments now, or that I would contradict you in order to stimulate the discussion. I can't, since I fully agree to everything which you said, so I will restrict my short comments to 3 complementary hypotheses or comments which hopefully might stimulate the discussion anyway, but which are definitely not opposed to whatever Andy said now. Let me come to the first comment, which is might be a thesis as well. Going back to the reasons, to the grounds for rising informal summitry. And I do think it is important to bear in mind that actually this rise in informal summitry, we always had informal summitry for centuries already, but this rise, which Andy accurately observed, was largely a reaction to the perceived inappropriateness of formal international organizations, to the perceived lack of legitimacy and efficiency of formal international organizations by industrialized countries, but especially by emerging countries, of course. So the BRICS themselves are a reaction to this perceived inappropriateness, for example, of the International Monetary Fund, where emerging markets did not get what they wanted to get. This is rising quotas and voting shares. To the World Bank, to the whole Bretton Woods system, which was perceived as being dominated and is still now perceived as being dominated by industrialized countries. And of course, you mentioned the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council is something being criticized heavily, not only by the BRICS, but also by other countries like Germany and Japan. And you all remember that Brazil, India, Germany, and Japan formed another informal summit or informal group, the G4, attempting to reform the UN Security Council by enlarging it by 4 members, by the very 4 which got together in this G4 group. So this perceived inappropriateness in terms of legitimacy, but also efficiency, is something which was actually at the root of informal summitry. And partly even our beloved hegemon, the United States, also joined into this club, since many US governments were always very frustrated about the UN and the UN Security Council whenever they could not instrumentalize it, whenever the United Nations system did not serve the interests of the United Nations. You remember that already in, I think it was like 25 years ago, Ted Turner, the founder of CNN, paid $1 billion to the UN because he was ashamed that his country, his government, and that was Ronald Reagan at that time, withhold the budget contribution which the United States actually owed to the United Nations, etc. But also remember the invasion of Iraq, where the United Nations Security Council did not approve US interests. So this is very important because, of course, the attempt which we have seen, the moderate attempt to increase legitimacy and efficiency of formal international organizations, would be theoretically a way to get more appropriate action and acceptance back to formal international organizations. The only attempt in the last years, which of these big international organizations, was actually the modest reform of the IMF governance structure, where emerging markets got more voting and quotas, but which is since then being blocked by US Congress, so it is still not in force, even though the members agreed in 2010 already on this moderate reform.
I very much like you stressing the importance of the stickiness of informal processes, and that you highlight that even informal processes, sort of when they are repeated, which most of them are nowadays, they leave their traces. And that reminds me that of an event we had last week at the German Development Institute, when an Indian ambassador came and stopped over on his way back from Rio, where the think tank meeting, or the sort of the academic meeting of the BRICS had been taking place before the actual BRICS summit, which will take place later in summer. And he stressed that maybe one of the most important effects that the BRICS on the BRICS meeting have is that the 5 countries are working more closely together. And it's not that they sort of form an alliance to challenge the global governance structure or the Western-dominated world order. They get to know each other, they sort of exchange ideas and experiences in different policy fields, and that has a big effect, or can have a bigger effect on the countries than anything else. And in a way, this sort of neatly ties up with what we are doing at the center. Dirk, among others, has authored a paper together with 2 colleagues where he describes that well, when diplomats, academics, or non-governmental actors get to know each other, they talk to each other, they maybe start to understand each other better, they may start to trust each other, they may start to care about what the other ones think about them, and maybe they even start to form some sort of we identity, even if it's a weird alphabet soup. I mean, people who BRICS or MICA, maybe that will not be the core identity of these diplomats, but it sort of helps to and builds a basis for cooperation, as Dirk and his colleagues have sort of said, because these elements are the basic elements of cooperation that we actually can see, or that researchers across different disciplines have identified.
I would like to play the balls which have been brought into the arena first back to Andrew, and then we go directly to the question and answer part. Andrew, would you like to pick up, maybe not all, no, but some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, a few of them. And some of them, again, we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. One is the sense of the change of view of leaders. And again, this sort of leader-centric nature, and I think both of the commentators brings this up in terms of 2008, 2009. We thought that leaders were different. We thought that leaders could deliver sort of big deals by themselves, get them in a room, right? That was always the message. And I'm sure we've seen the same in the UN, you know, certainly climate change, right? The idea of Obama meeting with other leaders. This is all you need. What we've seen is life is more complicated than that. That leaders in some ways have retreated. And in some ways, we were quite lucky, despite George W. Bush in 2008, to have a number of leaders that were quite economically sophisticated, looking at those are beginning to go. You know, and I think if you looked at the leaders now versus the leaders in 2008, we would see some sort of diminution of leader capacity. And it comes back to Zilka's point, and that does then the gap taken over by bureaucratic role. I mean, I see very mixed sort of impressions in this. I think what has come up is the middle powers. Middle powers with this sort of entrepreneurial skill, you know, and those sort of countries are the Koreans, to some extent the Mexicans, that grasp that opportunity and sort of globalize their bureaucracies. That these people are very capable. Again, our whole stereotypes, particularly of Mexico, I think go by the boards, right? I mean, the top tier is very good. And at the same time, the countries that don't have the entrepreneurial flair anymore, Canada, to some extent Australia, still have that technical capability. So it's sort of a good mix in that regard. This is the first point. The second is still that regional component. And again, I think there's an element. Do countries, if they're frustrated at the global level, also show all sorts of frustration at the regional level as well? And in some ways, the global can be easier, paradoxically, for some countries. And certainly, I think if we looked at the BRICS countries, was probably going global makes a lot more sense than going regionally, right? India is a pretty tough neighborhood, as Modi will come to discover. Certainly South Africa, certainly Brazil. It's going to, you know, there's as many chances of getting worse in regional components. So again, and we see this in the sort of second layer as well. There's a lot of evidence of countries like Indonesia getting more and more frustrated with ASEAN sort of politics. Easier to go global, have some sort of imprint on the global side. The sense of legitimacy, yes, you know, and I kind of leave this component out of the smaller countries, and this is always going to be a problem. But of course, it's a problem in the UN as well. You know, that many, of course, will point to the voice capabilities of small countries, but ECOSOC is not where the action is in terms of UN politics. To say that they're left out of the G20, I think probably takes the argument too far. In some ways, I think this is one of the hidden successes of the G20. That the smaller countries that had a great deal of resilience, but also were muddying the rules. Even small countries, of course, in Europe, I think we could see this. That these are countries that were playing the sort of strange game of having money from all sorts of different people, not with the concept that you would actually make money in terms of investment. You would just have the money there. And I think what the G20 has done, and through the OECD and others, has kind of forced those countries to have a different outlook now. And maybe this fits into a neoliberal component, but certainly I think anybody that thinks that fair taxation is a good idea, I think there's another argument on this as well. And I think with this is the sense of, and again, I left that out as well, is the sense of sort of NGO civil society. And again, there has been some sort of transition, grudging transition, I think, exactly what has been brought out, that we have sort of a bit of an equipoise now, where we're not going back, in a sense, to no G20. And because of all of these different politics that again, Stefan shows, that there's intricate, that there's layers. We're not sort of going back to this embedded, polarized view. But there's signs also that we're glimmers of moving forward with NGO participation, with philanthropic participation. And once more, the classic two examples of this are one, Oxfam, that sort of kind of embraced the G20 much quicker than other big NGOs. And Oxfam always takes a lot of hits from smaller NGOs because it's sort of seen as sort of being perhaps a little too adaptive to the new games in town. But again, Oxfam is also a good barometer, I think, of where the action is going. So the sense that Oxfam sort of changes its position is a sign, given that they take good positions, I think, on some issues, if not all issues. And the other, we cannot forget, even though it was a one-off, it shows the possibilities, both bad and good, for global governance. Because, of course, in the French G20, who did we see sitting around the table with the other leaders, or the leaders? We saw Bill Gates, not in a personal capacity, but in a capacity as the head of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So as much as I can figure out, maybe historians will give some digest back to the 19th century on health issues and so on, but there's probably, this is the first sign in a modern G20 or a modern summit that we see a non-state actor sitting at the table. And of course, this could be important in itself in terms of the resources that the Gates Foundation brings, but it also opens the door. Once you have that possibility, then there's other possibilities, and we'll look down. And again, maybe for some people this opens up all sorts of problematic doors, but for others it opens up valuable doors.
You put a lot of emphasis on the arbitrariness of informality, and I would say, yeah, well, there's valid reasons, but that probably goes for any special relationships. Or, you know, being a member of the G8 wants to get past the issue that economic indicators do mean anything as in terms of political power. It's also very arbitrary criteria, just, you know, as having won World War II and getting special powers in the Security Council.
I would like to add one question which goes to Stefan, actually. I found your observation that there is no clash of stable coalitions within G20 very interesting, because this, and you call this true multilateralism, no? Because this implies that within the G20 setting, the North-South divide, Western countries, non-Western countries, authoritarian, democratic countries, actually this is a non-existing structure, no? Changing coalitions. I find this very convincing. What I did not find so convincing is that you argue that this is all driven only or primarily by domestic interests and domestic coalitions. And my evidence is very anecdotal. We had a conference with the Foreign Ministry of Indonesia in 2010 after the first two G20 meetings. And we had a discussion with the Vice Minister. No? And what he talked about was interesting, a bit contradicting what your national coalition thinking, because he was arguing that since we are now member of the G20, for the first time, we need to consider what others think, no? What non-Indonesian actor coalitions, our colleagues in the G20 are reflecting on. No? So for the first time, going global, trying to create global perspectives, and then balancing this, of course, with national perspective and interests. No? So my question is, would you really argue that at the end of the day, it's driven, the G20 dynamic is driven by domestic alliances, no? Okay. So, good.
If I can, should I answer the, kind of link the two together? I mean, the question from the floor and Dirk's comment are interesting because they raise a couple of questions. One, of course, is national brands. You know, and I think Indonesia is a classic example that was looking, you know, if to use brands in a non sort of commercialized way, that looking for some sort of way of elevating themselves from again, a stereotypical image of the past, right? And you see this of advertisement for Indonesia. It was probably Indonesia was the first country that used or had the G20 in terms of their global advertising. G20, you know, Indonesia is a member of the G20. They also, of course, have a young cohort, demographics, and of course, a mature democracy. So again, you can see how countries utilize that type of imagery. And of course, the converse of that is that you're going to be a member of a club, exactly your point, and that you have to kind of behave in a different way. And I've heard this from Indonesians, maybe not in deliverables, but in terms of at least recognition of problems on forest fires, for instance. That if you're going to be a sort of a country in the big club, you can't kind of have things that look really damaging, not only to your own ecology, but damaging to your reputation. And therefore, you kind of have to raise your game in that sense. The other, and I think it's a very interesting question, because it strikes me is that the game, if you want to call it that, at the global summitry is very different than the game at the regional summitry process. And I think you have to bring in some ways to regional summits to tease out some of the differences. Because still at the regional summit, it's a game of exclusion, right? Everybody is always wanting to exclude somebody else in terms of regional games. I mean, you see this in the Americas right now, the split between the Brazilian, but also, of course, the Venezuelan sort of model of regionalism versus the US, Mexican, to some extent Canada, regionalism. And there it's very explicit about who is in, who is out, and to some extent on what basis. Some of it is geographical, but some of it, of course, is identity. Some of it is ideological. Again, going back to the points that Stefan had made. You see this in Asia Pacific on trade policy, right? In terms of who is in, who is out. And of course, in Europe, I'll remind you that some countries that have been waiting a long time, or one big country that's been waiting for a long time to join the EU is presumably excluded forever. So, you know, there's always going to be a very different game.
I would have a long list of questions in addition to what we have been discussing already, but we are running out of time, obviously. So we need to come to an end, and I would like to thank you all for your contributions. Andrew, your lecture, and then your answers to the questions. You two guys for your comments and answers also, and you for coming, coming here and for discussing with us. You are all invited to the reception now, which is directly outside the room. And thanks again for Andrew, Silke, and Stefan, and I think they gained an applause.